There is something almost involuntary about that gesture. Closing a door. The hand finds the handle, the body steps back, and the world stays on the other side. A brief sound, almost weightless, and yet carrying a history that very few people ever stop to think about. Because that moment, that small everyday action repeated dozens of times a day in millions of homes, was not always possible. There was a time, long and widespread, when closing a door to be alone was a privilege almost nobody had. Not because doors did not exist, but because the very idea of needing that gesture had not yet been born. For most of human history, the home was not a private space. It was, above all, a functional and collective one. In medieval Europe, even in the homes of reasonably prosperous families, rooms had no fixed use and no exclusive occupant. Rooms were spaces for passing through, gathering, working, and sleeping, all at once. Beds were shared, not only between couples or siblings, but between people who barely knew each other. Guests, servants, distant relatives, and neighbors could occupy the same sleeping space without it feeling uncomfortable or inappropriate. Intimacy, in the way it is understood today, simply was not a category that organized domestic life. The homes of working people were, in many cases, single rooms. One space that served as kitchen, dining room, bedroom, and often workshop or shop all at once. Large families lived, ate, and slept there without physical separation. The body had no territory of its own. Neither did thoughts, conversations, or relationships. Everything happened in the presence of others, because others were always there. But even in larger homes, the logic was similar. Medieval palaces and manor houses were not organized to protect the inhabitants' privacy. They were organized to display power and allow the movement of people. Halls were large and open. Servants moved freely through bedrooms. Visitors could access the most personal spaces of the household without special permission. The private life of the nobleman or lord was, in many ways, a life permanently on view. The change did not happen all at once. It was slow, both technical and cultural, and it found an unexpected foothold in the appearance of rooms with a specific purpose. By the 17th century, in some bourgeois households in Northern Europe, something new began to emerge. Rooms started to have names. It was no longer just the big room or the hall. There was a space for sleeping, another for receiving guests, another for eating. This specialization of domestic space seems like a minor detail, but it was, in fact, a profound transformation. When a room has a defined function, it also begins to have a defined occupant. And when there is a defined occupant, the idea of who can and cannot enter starts to matter. Even so, the specialization of space did not solve a fundamental practical problem. To get from one room to another, you still had to walk through someone else's. Houses of that era, even the largest ones, were organized in enfilade, meaning one room led directly into the next, which led into the next, in a linear sequence. To go from the main bedroom to the children's room, you had to pass through the library. To go from the library to the dining room, you had to cross the parlor. Movement inside the house was unavoidably intrusive. The solution came from architecture, and it had a precise name: the corridor. The introduction of the hallway as a structural element of the home was, in terms of privacy, a quiet revolution. The corridor allowed rooms to stop connecting directly to each other and instead connect to a neutral circulation space. Suddenly it was possible to move through the house without entering anyone's room. Each room became separate, accessible only to whoever chose to enter it, and that choice was no longer automatic. Architectural historians place the expansion of the residential corridor in 17th century England and its spread across the rest of Europe during the 18th. It was not an instant or universal shift. Poorer homes took much longer to incorporate it, and in many contexts, it never arrived at all. But where it did, it irreversibly transformed the structure of domestic life. With the corridor came a sharper awareness of the threshold. The closed door took on a new meaning. It was no longer just a barrier against cold or noise. It was a signal. It said, "Here begins a space that is not a passageway. Here is someone who chose to be a part." And for that signal to work effectively, the door needed something more than wood and hinges. It needed a lock. Locks have existed since antiquity. The Egyptians used wooden pin tumbler mechanisms more than 4,000 years ago. The Romans developed metal locks with portable keys, some small enough to be worn as rings. But for centuries, locks inside a home were exceptional. They were used on chests, trunks, and exterior doors, in other words, to protect valuables or to keep the outside out, not to protect intimacy within the household. The idea of locking the door to one's own bedroom was, for most of history, a gesture without meaning in a world where privacy was not an expected value. The migration of the lock to the interior of the home was gradual and followed the same pace as the specialization of rooms. As bedrooms became spaces belonging to one person or a couple, as the idea that such a space was someone's own became culturally established, the demand for mechanisms that made that ownership physical also grew. The lock moved from the chest to the bedroom door, and that movement was, in a sense, the movement of privacy from the object to the body. But the deepest transformation came from somewhere that has nothing to do with doors or walls. It came from water. For centuries, the most basic bodily needs were, by definition, shared. Wells and fountains were public or communal spaces. Personal hygiene, at best, took place in a room with others, with water carried in from outside. Toilets, when they existed, were external structures or shared facilities. The body and its functions were part of collective life in a way that is difficult to imagine today. The arrival of running water inside homes, a process that unfolded mainly across the 19th century in the industrialized cities of Europe and North America, changed that logic entirely. When water came indoors, it became possible to build a dedicated space for bodily care. The enclosed bathroom, with hot water, with a lockable door, was perhaps the most radically private space domestic architecture ever produced. It was a place where the body could be alone, unseen, uninterrupted. A space designed not for work, sleep, or socializing, but exclusively for being with oneself. The spread of the private bathroom in middle-class homes took place across the second half of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th. It was not a uniform or simultaneous process. Differences in class, geography, and access to sanitary infrastructure created very different realities. But where the private bathroom took hold, so did a new conception of the body as personal territory, something that was not displayed, not shared, not explained. That technical shift was accompanied by a cultural one. Throughout the 19th century, alongside industrialization and the rise of the modern city, a new set of ideas about interior life began to take shape. The home stopped being understood purely as a space for production and survival, and began to be seen as a refuge, a place of retreat from the public world, the domain where it was possible to be oneself, free from the codes and demands of collective space. The distinction between public and private, which today seems natural and obvious, was in fact a slow construction that required architectural, technological, and conceptual changes accumulating over centuries. Locks, corridors, running water, bathrooms, the specialization of rooms. Each of these elements was, on its own, a technical adjustment. But together, in sequence, they formed something larger. They built the material conditions for a certain kind of life to become possible. A life where the body has a space of its own, where thought can happen without witnesses, where rest does not require negotiation with others. Closing a door is still a small gesture. But in that gesture, centuries of architecture, plumbing, metalwork, and ideas about the self and about others are compressed. Intimacy is not something human beings have always had. It is something they built, brick by brick, lock by lock, corridor by corridor. And like everything that was built, it could have been built differently. That is what makes that brief, almost weightless sound of a closing door so extraordinary.